When we left yesterday, we were with the Honourable Member for Abbotsford. The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to continue debate. And Mr. Speaker, yesterday, when I started my debate, I quoted the words of King Solomon out of the Proverbs. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Now that admonition is actually etched on Canada's Peace Tower over here. And there's a reason why it's etched there. It's a reminder to governments, it's a reminder to leaders, including the Prime Minister, that we are called upon, those of us who are in this august chamber, not only to lead by example, but to lead with vision, and to have a long-term view of the best interests of our country. I mentioned yesterday that I believed that this budget reflected an unserious Prime Minister, an unserious Finance Minister, and quite frankly, an unserious government. And I know there were a few of my Liberal colleagues that didn't like my reference to unserious, but the reality is, I believe it's a fair characterization of what's happened in this budget. Quite frankly, a serious Prime Minister wouldn't say budgets balance themselves. A serious Prime Minister wouldn't say that he doesn't think about monetary policy, which is so critical today as we discuss inflation. And you know, a serious Prime Minister wouldn't take a budget, cut it down by half in terms of a number of pages, down from 700 last year down to 300 this year, but then not cut anything else. Why is it that this government somehow has made the assumption that bigger, and bigger government is better? It isn't. We as Conservatives believe that as much as possible, government should remain small. It should be as least intrusive into the lives of Canadians as possible. And so, by the way, Mr. Speaker, should the tax burden. I'll get to that in a second. I want to touch on four main things, Mr. Speaker. I want to firstly talk about whether this is a growth budget. I want to talk about inflation and the cost of living, which is, of course, the biggest thing facing Canadians right now. I want to talk about spending. This is a big spending budget. It's not only big spending, it's big permanent spending that is going to saddle future generations of Canadians with a massive debt challenge. And then I want to talk about taxes and tax increases. You know, this Liberal government always talks about having Canadians' backs, having taxpayers' backs. The problem is it's all rhetoric. It's actually empty, vacuous rhetoric, because every budget that they table, the tax burden on Canadians increases and increases and increases. And I'll get to that in a moment. So let me start by talking about growth. One of the biggest challenges facing Canada today is the fact that we have an economy that is not positioned for long-term success. Economist after economist after economist, thought leader after thought leader has said that Canada's competitiveness is leaving it way behind in the global marketplace. Yes. And I'll talk in a moment about what that means. But the problem is that this government loves to put out documents like this budget. And smack dab in the title of that budget is the word growth. They want Canadians to believe that they have now heavily invested in driving growth in Canada. Well, the reality is they haven't. Why is growth so important? Why is fundamental growth so important? Why are the structural deficiencies in our economy so pernicious when it comes to our long-term prosperity as a country? It's because we're undermining our ability to compete on the global stage. That is the problem. If we can learn to produce more per person, more units per person, we drive prosperity, and what we do is we actually mitigate the inflationary pressures we face today in our economy. A lot of my liberal friends don't understand that. But if we can become more productive as an economy, as a nation, we reduce the likelihood of runaway inflation. We reduce the likelihood that the Bank of Canada, our central bank, has to step in and start increasing interest rates the way it's doing now. Mr. Speaker, this is a budget that will only fuel inflation because it's all about spend, spend, spend. There's virtually nothing about growth. And when you talk about the few elements in this budget that actually touch on growth, it's actually about giving subsidies to the private sector. I don't know why the NDP isn't screaming bloody murder. They hate subsidies to the private sector. And yet there's a $15 billion fund here in this budget that effectively amounts to using taxpayers' dollars to incent private companies to invest in themselves, to invest in clean technology, etc. Mr. Speaker, there's nothing in this budget that addresses the issue of interprovincial trade barriers, which is one of the most significant underminers of economic performance in our country. In many ways, we have freer trade with our free trade partners around the world than we have free trade amongst our 10 provinces, 3 territories. That's really a sad comment on our country, that our federal relationship cannot actually overcome barriers that prevent us from freely trading amongst ourselves. There's nothing in this budget to address comprehensive tax reform. We as Conservatives have been calling for comprehensive tax reform. Even the Finance Committee, in one of its earlier reports and studies, called specifically for comprehensive tax reform. Why? Well, firstly, we want to make sure that our tax system is fair, that those who really can't afford to pay taxes don't, those that shouldn't be paying a high tax rate don't, and those that should be paying their fair taxes should and do. Mr. Speaker, there's 4 areas of tax performance that I'll get to in a moment, but if we can get tax reform right, you can be assured that Canada will again become a place where the world wants to invest. Right now, Canada's investment performance, now you won't believe this, but our investment performance as a country is the very worst in the 30 OECD countries. Many of those are in the EU. It, of course, includes Japan, includes the United States, includes Canada. We're at the bottom of the list of those 30 countries when it comes to being able to attract investment from around the world. Foreign direct investment, as it's called, FDI. That is a terrible performance. This government has had 7 years to fix that problem, and they've done nothing about it other than throw a little bit of money at it. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's also nothing in here in this budget about rural broadband. One of the best things we can do as a country is invest in the infrastructure that will bring rural broadband to every single Canadian, especially rural Canadians, many of whom still don't have broadband. Because when we give Canadians access to broadband, we link them to the rest of the world. We link them to the rest of their country. We link them to the rest of their community. And when you do that, you improve productivity and our ability to compete. and produce in this country, whether it's products, whether it's services. We can do it more efficiently if we have comprehensive broadband infrastructure across our country. There's virtually nothing in this budget except to signal that, well, we did a little bit in the last couple of years, so that should be good enough. Mr. Speaker, when we're talking about competitiveness within the global stage, that is not enough. Mr. Speaker, there's nothing in this budget about trade-related or climate-related resiliency. In fact, I noted yesterday there was one glaring hole in this budget. There were a number of us on this side of the House, some of whom are in this House right now, listening to me speak, whose communities were devastated by the atmospheric river event that took place in BC last year in November. This massive amount of rain that fell and the flooding that ensued. In my community of Abbotsford, the whole Sumas Prairie was flooded. A prairie that is full of chicken farmers, egg farmers, dairy farmers, blueberry growers, vegetable growers, greenhouses. It goes on and on and on. In fact, Abbotsford is the agriculture capital of British Columbia. We are the breadbasket of our province, and for much of the country, by the way. We're the #1 farm gate producer in the country per hectare. So you can understand when one of our big prairies is underwater, 4, 5, 6 feet, and the devastation that wreaked. We begged this minister, we sent a letter to her, co-signed by a number of our colleagues, MP colleagues on the Conservative side. Please, Minister, take this seriously. This was a 1-in-100-year event that is probably going to become a much more regular event due to climate change-related weather patterns. This is going to happen again. It could happen this coming year, could happen 3 years from now, but it's going to happen again. Did the minister listen to us? Did she reach out to us and say, hey, listen, what's this all about? What specifically would you like us to do? What are the projects you think I should fund? She didn't even reach out. Surely we as a country can do better when one of the most significant climate-related events doesn't even get a mention in this budget, isn't worthy of a mention. To protect human life, to protect livestock, to protect livelihoods. Clearly the minister doesn't care. So, Mr. Speaker, I've mentioned all of the different areas of this budget that could have addressed the issue of growth, but didn't. And so I'll go on to say that if there is going to be a recovery, a deeply rooted economic recovery, not a shallow recovery, as we're experiencing right now, not an inflation-driven recovery where Canadians actually get left further and further behind, if we're going to have a true, thoroughly rooted recovery within an economically competitive economy, that needs to be driven by the private sector, by our small businesses, by our medium-sized businesses, and yes, by our many large businesses across Canada. This should not be bigger and bigger and bigger government trying to steer the economy in the right direction and always getting it wrong. Next, I'd like to talk about inflation and the cost of living. Now, you may recall, Mr. Speaker, in the last budget, 1 year ago, this minister stood up in this House, and in addition to all of the other massive spending that she was undertaking in that last budget, by the way, that was the biggest spending budget in Canadian history. Much of it has gone to waste. But she got up in this House and she said, and colleagues, fellow MPs, I'm also setting aside over $100 billion worth of investment, which I'm going to call stimulus. I want to use this stimulus to plug it into the economy, inject it into the economy, because the economy is not doing that well. We want to make sure that so we're priming the pump, so to speak. And we thought, Oh, we can see where this is going to go. And then she cautioned us. She said, listen, I'm going to take care that we don't pump too much stimulus into the economy, because we all know around this house, if you pump too much stimulus, too much cash into the economy, that's more cash chasing the same number of goods and services. That creates inflation. So she said, I'm going to take care of that. I'm going to make sure that consumers are protected, that Canadians are protected. And she said, I'm going to put in place guardrails, labor-based guardrails, a number of other guardrails that will give me an idea of whether this stimulus is actually required, so that I don't make the mistake of pumping too much in and driving inflation. Because at that time, a year ago, inflation wasn't at the level it is today. Well, fast forward to today. Yesterday I was in the lockup, in the budget lockup. We get to ask questions of the government, of the officials. And we wanted to know what happened to the stimulus. How much of the stimulus was actually spent? Were the guardrails applied? How much of that stimulus is left unspent? Well, there was no answer. They stumbled, they fumbled. They said, well, we can't really identify how much of that stimulus is spent because, you know what, it's been allocated to different departments and they're responsible for reporting on their own spending, so we can't really tell you that. What about the guardrails? What about these protective measures that were to ensure that not too much cash was pumped into our economy that would stimulate inflation? We don't know. We don't know. There's no answer. Well, today I think we know what the answer is. Every single penny of that $100+ billion was pumped straight into the economy. And guess what we have today?
Inflation.
The worst inflation in over 30 years, driven by the actions of this government. Now, I'll be the first, Mr. Speaker, to acknowledge that not all inflation is driven just by what we do in Canada. Yes, there are supply chain constraints around the world. Yes, there are spikes in commodity prices around the world that drive up the cost of living. That's consumer price inflation. But there's something else called asset price inflation. Things like houses. And that is a Canada-made problem. It's a Canada-made inflation problem. Now, Mr. Speaker, that inflation, of course, has left millions of Canadians behind. Canadians that want to get into the housing market, Canadians that can no longer afford to buy groceries for their kids. They're cutting back. Canadians that can't buy household goods. Mr. Speaker, we're now in an affordability crisis in this country, and this government has to bear some of that blame. And this budget simply makes it worse. It exacerbates the inflationary pressures we have in our country, because what it does is this is a big spending budget. Spend, 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 more cash being pumped into the economy, driving inflation. Canadians should not in any way expect inflation to go down in the medium term, even in the short term. In fact, we had the Bank of Canada governor before Finance Committee not long ago, and he said, listen, you should expect that things are going to get worse before they're going to get better. Is that on this Liberal government? Of course it is. They're the ones responsible for government spending, and this budget represents a massive government expenditure. Mr. Speaker, I got into the spending part of it. There's $56 billion of new spending in this budget. That's massive. And what's worse is this, Mr. Speaker. Most of this $56 billion of new spending is new permanent spending. Now, I want to remind you of something. Back in January of this past year, 2021, just over a year ago, this finance minister received a mandate letter from the Prime Minister. Now, for those who don't know what a mandate letter is, it's simply a long set of instructions the Prime Minister gives to either new ministers or other ministers for whom he wants to refresh their directions. And he gave her this mandate letter, and right there in the middle of that letter, it said, "Minister, you will not embark on any new permanent spending, period, full stop. No new permanent spending." That was her instruction just over a year ago, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, when they were spending wildly, and perhaps there were some justifiable reasons for spending a little bit more than we normally do in a budget. Here we are in March, just 4 months ago, which was at the end of 2021, for some reason the Prime Minister decided to give the Finance Minister a new mandate letter. This is some 11 months later. And we looked at it carefully. I'm looking for it, and there's no reference on new permanent spending. They had purged the document of that directive. So anyone who thinks that this Liberal government is committed to living within its means, forget it, as my colleague just said. Forget it. This is not a serious government, as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, and you cannot take seriously any of the commitments that they make, because tomorrow they'll change their mind and say, too bad, tough luck, be happy. So, Mr. Speaker, there's a ton of spending in this budget. Of course, there's the NDP spending on dental care. We see there's spending on more spending on the failed Canada Infrastructure Bank. In fact, they've expanded the mandate of this failed Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is finding itself incapable of getting money out the door and actually making the investments in infrastructure that are required in our country. More spending, more wasteful spending, and who pays for it? Taxpayers and consumers, because the spending drives inflation, leaving Canadians behind, but then the taxpayers have to also pay the bill for this spending. And of course, Mr. Speaker, I haven't even mentioned the fact that this is actually an NDP Liberal government. This is an unholy alliance. And guess who's the tail that's wagging the dog? It's the NDP, you bet. So the NDP is telling this Liberal government how much of taxpayers' dollars they should be spending. And it goes on and on and on. Many of the asks that the NDP had when they shacked up with the Liberals in their common law relationship, many of those asks haven't been reflected in this budget. They're coming in the next and the following budget. It's coming, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you. So there are also promises that this government made in the last election, which didn't show up in this budget. So, Mr. Speaker, there is more spending to come. And the suggestion from this finance minister that somehow she was going to rein in spending and discipline spending, and this was all in safe hands, their record says otherwise. In fact, did you know, Mr. Speaker, that since they came into power, the Liberals came to power, they have increased government spending, get this, by 53% in just over 6 years. Increased government spending by 53%. And much of that is permanent spending. So future generations of Canadians are stuck with this. And this is spending that is generating inflation in our economy. Even since the crisis, the pandemic in 2019, did you know that government spending has gone up 25%? And this minister stands up in this House and claims that she is disciplining government spending. She's reining it in. Trust me.
It's raining.
That's what she said.
It's raining spending.
Get the calculator out,
So, Mr. Speaker, I also talked about taxes. This budget is full of tax increases, and they've done it very discreetly. You know, you have to explore the different corners of this budget to find these tax increases. Of course, there's increases on alcohol taxes because there's an escalator built into excise taxes on alcohol. So this government, what it did back in 2017, they did something really clever. They said, we don't want to keep going back to the representatives of the people and ask them for permission to spend taxpayers' money. What we're going to do is we're going to build into our structure an escalator that automatically kicks in every year and increases taxes on Canadians every single year. They did that with this excise tax. Let me talk about GST. Because we have inflation in Canada, Mr. Speaker, the GST revenues to this government have skyrocketed. Because there's oil and gas revenues that have come in. The price of gasoline at the pump has gone way, way up, leaving Canadians behind, unable to fill up their gas tanks, unable to get their kids to school, unable to get to work, unable to drive their kids to hockey practice or to music lessons. And so on top of that high price of gasoline, this government, of course, layers the GST. And the more inflation sets in, the more GST revenues this government collects, which is why it had these windfall revenues this past year. Those windfall revenues weren't good management on their part. It wasn't an underlying strong economic performance. Mr. Speaker, what this was about this government benefiting from inflation, the Prime Minister benefiting from inflation through higher GST revenues, through higher excise tax revenues, but leaving Canadians behind because they have to pay the price for that. That's unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Completely unacceptable. We as Canadians are better than that. Well, there's something in this budget about housing. And the minister made a big thing about housing. And I asked her a question yesterday after she gave her budget speech, because I mentioned that housing is the number one concern facing Canadian families, especially those that aren't in a home. They can't get into a home anymore because inflation, housing affordability, has left them behind. In fact, in Canada, the price of housing has doubled. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker? Has over doubled since this Liberal government came into power. We didn't see that kind of housing inflation under Stephen Harper, did we? No, it was steady increases, but it was controlled. Prices were stable. Today, prices are no longer stable, and families have been left behind. So when I asked the minister, the finance minister yesterday, the question, she couldn't respond. All she said was, yes, you're right. Housing is the number one problem here in this country right now, especially for Canadian families. But she made a statement, Mr. Speaker. She made the suggestion that she was going to double the number of houses she was going to build in Canada over the next 10 years. You remember that? Yeah. She stood up and she said, I promise this House, I promise Canadians over the next 10 years, I'm going to double the number of homes we build. She used the word we. I'm assuming it was the royal we. She was referring to her government. Okay, so I asked her the question. Madam Minister, if you're going to double the number of houses, you must know how many houses you and your government have built over the last 10 or say 7 years since they were elected. You must know that figure, because without knowing that figure, it would be irresponsible to make the statement that you're going to double the number of homes you're going to build. I said, I just need a number. How many homes did you build in the 7 years you were actually in government? She hummed and hawed. She spent, I think, 2.5 minutes, pontificating and arguing around the question. She never answered the question, even though some of my colleagues here were calling out, but what's the number? What's the number? How many homes did you build in the last 7 years? She couldn't give an answer, and yet she made the statement she's going to double the number of houses over the next 10 years, the number that she doesn't even know. That is the kind of economic and financial and fiscal leadership we have with this NDP Liberal government. So, Mr. Speaker, there is one way we can actually address the skyrocketing cost of housing in this country. In fact, there's a way we can address the issue of skyrocketing inflation broadly speaking. Whether it's on gas, whether it's on household goods, anything you buy, the services you buy in your community, they've all gone up because of inflation. There is a way of controlling inflation, especially in the housing market. You know what that is? Control government spending. Thank you for asking. Control government spending. Instead, this government has done the very opposite. It is fanning the flames of inflation. In fact, it's poured gasoline on the flames of inflation. And the things are going to only get worse in the short to medium term. So, Mr. Speaker, before I finish, and I do have a motion to make, I did want to mention, like any budget that is full of bad policies and massive liberal spending, there are always a few things that we can support. For example, the announcement of enhanced defense spending is something we would support. Now, the reality is, it's this government that has allowed defense spending to lag way behind. Now they're catching up. But we see this as simply a down payment, a $6 billion down payment for strengthening our ability to defend ourselves as a country and to engage in the global community of nations when it's required. We can support a $3.8 billion critical minerals strategy. We can support that as well, Mr. Speaker, because critical minerals are critically important in the electric vehicle industry, which we're trying to get a foothold in. And I'd love to see Canada become a leader in that. There's a ban on foreign home buyers for 2 years. I think we can support that, can't we, colleagues? Sure. I think so. And, of course, for small businesses, there's a small improvement when it comes to the small business tax rate. Small businesses across the country will be pleased that at least the government has now finally, after years of pleading, agreed to adjust the phase-out schedule for the small business tax rate. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a budget that is profoundly lacking in vision. I mentioned that at the beginning of my speech. We Canadians could do better. We have so much wealth in our country, the natural resources, the human capital, the education we have in this country. We can do so much better than having to always borrow tens and hundreds of billions of dollars every time a government tables a budget. We can do better. We shouldn't have to be doing this. And in the process, as we do this, we kick more money into the economy, we drive inflation, leaving millions of Canadians behind. We can do better. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to move, seconded by the member for Simcoe North, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following: the House not approve the budgetary policy of the government since it fails to A, rein in spending in order to control inflation, B, provide Canadians with tax relief, and C, take immediate action to increase housing supply. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.